So welcome. So this was our tentative plan to start with Austria, to be discussed by Ireland and Moldova. But if we don't have someone from Moldova just yet, we can actually start with another country. So is there anyone who wants to go first and who has discussants available here? Austria, I think you don't. Yeah, you don't have Moldova here. What about Bulgaria? In the case of Bulgaria, we don't have
the same Moldova.
Yeah. Okay, Ireland. I think Ireland seems to be the best candidate for us to start with, right?
Sure.
Going to be Professor Stone?
Apparently, I didn't realize that.
Okay.
None of my other teammates have showed up today, so
yeah.
I guess.
Okay, same with me.
So I'll yeah. Well, I'll give you the short version of the report, and I think perhaps it might also be useful just to mention briefly. You know, I'd mentioned that I had drafted a report of talking about some of the sort of the theoretical reflections or implications of the Irish case. So perhaps if I have time, I'll spend, it might be productive to spend a few of my 10 minutes on that. So let's see. So Ireland, I guess, is kind of one of these the cases people are paying a lot of attention to. So probably you know a lot of the details already. I'll give you the sort of the general rundown of the Irish experience there. You know, so Ireland has a constitution that has always required popular referendum since 1937. Since we had popular referendums have been necessary, and the institutionalization of deliberation for that has been, I guess, a little bit spotty. It's been up and down. As Celia brought up earlier today in the first working group, there has been, I guess you could say, a level of incremental constitutional change, because of course we have a Supreme Court which engages in interpretation that in certain cases has extended the Constitution in ways that might not have been anticipated. And I am definitely not an expert in this subject, but my understanding is that in this way, the Irish Supreme Court took a direct inspiration from the US Supreme Court. And that had far-reaching implications, because one of the reasons why Ireland ever had a constitutional ban on abortion was because even though abortion was already illegal in the country, the Irish Supreme Court had followed the U.S. Supreme Court in, for example, recognizing a constitutional right of privacy, which required, for example, recognizing the right of married couples to access contraception. And in the United States, it was directly that Supreme Court decision that led to the legalization of abortion in the United States. So the referendum was to sort of copper fasten the ban on abortion to head off the Supreme Court doing that. So there's definitely been this tradition of informal constitutional amendment. The attempt to interject a deliberative component into the process comes very much as an inspiration from the collapse of the Celtic Tiger in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And that in particular follows from an experiment run out of the Political Studies Association of Ireland, or taking leadership from that, called the We the Citizens Project, which was a pilot experiment. It did not have any official sanction from the government, and it involved first a sort of a public consultation in various parts of Ireland, basically town hall style meetings in all the different regions of Ireland, and then followed by a randomly selected citizens assembly. And it was charged with this idea of sort of envisioning, you know, sort of a future for Ireland in a very general sense. And it took up a lot of different topics under that. One of the sort of the features of the Irish experience, by the way, I mean, I think Ireland, maybe this is not fair to say, given I'm not from this country, but Ireland's really, really good at trying to do things cheap. And so the Irish experience with these experiments has been, okay, we're going to have it. We're going to convene people for a couple of weekends. Let's give them 25 things to talk about. You know, while we have them there, let's get as much value as we possibly can. And that's occasionally resulted in rather crammed agendas. And that certainly applies to the first official experiment, which takes place in, I think it's in 2012, after there's an election and Fine Gael and Labour form a new government. Both parties had pledged to do something like this. And so they called an assembly taking up a variety of topics, the most contentious of which was the marriage equality topic. They selected an assembly of 100 people, 66 randomly selected ordinary citizens, stratified according to the usual dimensions, 33 members of the elected assemblies in both the Republic of Ireland and the Northern Ireland, proportional to the size of the parties, and one nonpartisan chair. And a lot of people were very suspicious of it, especially because of the presence of the elected representatives. The existing evidence that my colleagues seem to think is that there does not seem to have been a format that led to the domination of the event by the elected politicians there. That's from the evidence. There were, I gather, some very thorny issues regarding data collection because the government was trying to sort of respect the privacy of the individuals in the group, in the citizens, in the small group deliberations. Maybe this is also the point to mention that the fact that the assembly adopted a sort of a deliberative format at all was kind of an serendipitous. It was probably because of the We the Citizens experiment directly. There was nothing in the government's initial instructions that insisted it be deliberative. They could have, for example, just adopted a more of an official, like parliamentary style caucus system where everyone caucuses with their party and that kind of thing. That was within the rules. They didn't do that. But it seems to have been because the chair, along with some of the other organizers of the event, said, hey, we should do things more like what We the Citizens did. And that meant large group sessions for presentations by experts and other witnesses combined with small group plenary sessions, breakout sessions, which was the deliberative component. That led to a variety of recommendations. None of them, I guess you could say, had the form of a sort of here is a proposal ready to go to vote. They were recommendations that the government had pledged to take up. But by take up, that government pledged it would respond to each of them, and the response could just be no, which is exactly what they did, for example, with the recommendation that the government constitutionalize social and economic rights. The government basically just said, no, we don't think that's a good idea. That was their response. But some of the others went to referenda. That led directly to the, two subsequent conventions. The first was called the Convention on the Constitution. The second two were both called Citizens' Assemblies. The second, of course, was the one that considered, among other topics, the constitutional ban on abortion and led to the famous referendum there. This was consisting entirely of randomly selected citizens, again, stratified. And that seems to have not affected the impact that it's had. The assumption seems to have been, or I'd say the conventional wisdom seems to have been, that the presence of politicians in the initial assembly sort of convinced politicians that this wasn't a dangerous, scary mechanism, and therefore they were prepared to sort of not be involved in the future. Although the other possibility is that with the Citizens' Assembly in particular, and it's taking up the abortion ban, that there were a lot of politicians that did not want to be involved in that. They did not want to be placing themselves in the line of fire for that issue, given it was considered such a contentious issue. So they, but of course, that did ultimately lead to the repeal of the ban, and now we are having our third of these assemblies. These, again, are called Citizens' Assembly. Again, it's only 99 randomly selected citizens plus impartial chair. This time called to consider, among other things, the question of the status of women in the family in the Irish Constitution, because Ireland has a fairly traditional sounding language about the importance of women as, you know, as the center of the family. It hasn't led directly to any kind of like deep constitutional implications, but there are questions about what could replace that language. I think with all of these, the goal has been not to sort of just say, okay, something as straightforward as, oh, we don't like the constitutional ban on abortion, let's just repeal that amendment or something like that. That's more, you know, more the United States model of constitutional amendment or constitutional repeal, but much more of a detailed constructive response. But then the constitutional convention, citizens' assemblies have only provided, I guess, guidance to that. They have not produced concrete proposals like, here is a proposal, here is specific language that we wish to use. That has been considered a strength and also a weakness of it. And so maybe just let me wrap up, because I think I'm running out of time. I think the one of the major things, as you can see, major theoretical questions that's coming out of this is this question of the back and forth between the politicians and the randomly selected ordinary citizens there. And their ability to kind of force politicians to do something they don't want to do is pretty much zero, I think. And that can be witnessed by the ability of politicians to just say, we don't like your proposal, we're not going to do anything with it, which they have done. On the other hand, there have definitely been things that have come out of that. And so where politicians have wanted to act on it, it has definitely led to action. Action that hadn't been possible before. I mean, Ireland had this demand made on it for 30 years to repeal its constitutional ban on abortion, or at least limit it. But it wasn't until the Citizens' Assembly happened that anything happened with that. And it's hard to imagine that's a coincidence, I think. So let me just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stone. So we have Spain to comment on Ireland's report, if you can, Professor Garcia.
As I talk too much, I think Adai should start, and after he can give me some minutes.
Okay, sure.
Some comments.
In my case, it's only one little comment, and it's related to the regulation of the amendment procedure in the Irish constitution, because I mean, it's just a very wide guess at this moment to see how it is related, the participation of the people, and if we can look for a relationship between those cases, that is Ireland and Iceland, where the deliberative constitutionalism is taking a better role, or is getting developed. So if we see in the case of Ireland that, please correct me, Professor Stone, that always every amendment of the constitution must go to a referendum and must be always. For example, in our case, it's only in those cases where we go for a full reform of the constitution, or when there are the fundamental political issues, or when we are talking about the title first, the monarchy, the title first, the fundamental rights, or the title second, the monarchy. So in our case, it's very limited, the participation through a referendum of the people in the constitutional amendment. In our case, the two amendments that we had already, the people didn't vote in a referendum. So in the case of Ireland, we are seeing that the constitution in some way is allowing, demanding that participation of the people always. So I don't know if this is strengthening. Obviously, it's not a cause and effect relationship, but at least could be strengthening the possibilities of developing deliberative constitutionalism in Ireland.
Thank you.
Elena?
Thank you. I have so many comments. I think the Irish case is especially interesting for us because it's applying a theory that is recent. It shows the recent development on the theories of deliberation and participation. If we talk in general about deliberation, we should start before. And that's why in my group, I'm very, very boring, but I insist that depending on how we envision deliberation, we have it or not, or we have to promote it in one sense or the other. So I think the Irish case is the case where they have a crisis, they have some problems due to their own peculiarities, and there is the moment where some, and it's written in the paper, some academics specialized on this have a chance to make a different proposals to create this type of assemblies. This is very interesting because in the Irish case, they follow all the, I will say, the normative procedures already developed in the theory in the last years. So it's very important because the innovation, the special innovation is that they introduce mechanisms that allowed some citizens without affiliations. I don't want to call them citizens because I think that the civil society activists and actors are also citizens. So, but this what they call these ordinary citizens with no previous affiliation or anything. They are within a mechanism to participate on the debate. So it's very interesting because if we think on the dates of these proposals, is the decade after the big economic crisis. So it's not a casualty, something aleatory, that they come within the perspective, the general perspective of what we can call, in a way, the populist mood, that is a mistrust of the ordinary representatives, etc. If we think about that, this is very important because what we are doing with this mechanism is to create a way of representing citizens, just using not activist affiliated citizens. So, but this is a way of representing citizens. If you see the numbers on the experiment, on the assembly, the maximum is around 100, or sometimes it's less, because in the first assembly there is a combination of 30, something like this, no? 30, something. Politicians, they distinguish the civil society members in general that represent, they are representative of some identities or claims or anything in society, and then a representation of citizens, but using sortition, but from a previous compromise with the activity. So it's funny when you are reading the analysis and the description of these processes, because usually they have private companies, they call by telephone, and they are trying to recruit citizens, no? And many of them they reject. I don't know, in some experiments, for example, there is an acceptance each, I don't know, 100 or more of calls. This is important because there is also a self-selection of the participants, a previous self-selection. And then the second thing is that they insist on the paper, and this is important in the analysis, that they have to be representative of a society. And this is very controversial in many societies. Maybe not in the Irish case, in this context, but in others when there are different identities, and the most important cleavage is territorial identities. This can be very controversial also in the way of, you have to organize that. So I think the Irish case is the perfect example. I think they did it well because they had the right scholars following the procedure and proposing that, the way to organize that. And also because it's important because due to many traits, specific traits of the constitution, the characteristics of the specific constitution of Ireland, and also the cleavages, so they have success. But I'm going to just comment very briefly, for example, about one of the success was around the abortion, and the other was on the gay marriage. This is very important because on the paper they write, for example, that the approval of the gay marriage, it was by a referendum of directly from the people, and this is like a big success. And I wonder, if it was as it was in Spain, in the context of a very Catholic tradition, traditional society, how we can manage to approve this with almost organic laws without changing the constitution, and with a huge support of these laws. No, and what do you think on the case of the abortion? It was really controversial. There were a lot of debates, but debates in society, not structures as this type of assembly. So what I was wondering when we were doing also the paper on the report on Spain is why we now tend to understand deliberation linked just with this type of what they call citizen assemblies or specific assemblies, supported by the idea that they allowed a direct participation of citizens, but in practice, they are a way of representing citizens as other type of measures that can have a sense. I mean, in favor of that, but what it bothers me is that I don't agree on some of the discourses and the arguments in favor of doing these things. So, after we are going to see the differences with the report on Spain, and we can continue with this discussion, with this debate. But in the case I think the Irish case is the success of this type of discourses applying to a specific case for the reform of the constitution. But we have to be very careful in the sense that this reality cannot just reproduce as such in other places, because the meanings of the constitution are different. The strategies to change the constitution are very, very different, and also the trajectory of the hot cases, because in Irish it has taken much more time than in Spain to arrive to this change on, for example, the abortion law, and the supports are also different. And when we are thinking on the constitutional structure, we have to be very, very careful and not just directly to apply some strategies and narratives that are good when you are dealing at other levels, just to decide, for example, and is a change, at the constitutional level, we are thinking about the basic structures and the basic principles of the laws. And when we change to the local level, everybody is on the discourse of governance, of deciding about the specific cases with the directly affected participants involved. So it's a very different, from a normative point of view, it's a very different, approach and a very different reality. So I think it's very interesting, the contrast between the reports of the countries, because then we are going to be able to realize how these equilibriums and strategies and processes really change. And I think we should be careful in the sense of not just creating some fascias. But I can just to finish say that this is going to be reproduced, the Irish example is going to be reproduced in many of our countries for many questions, because in the context of this wide feeling of crisis and mistrust of the mediation of political parties, etc., these calls to involve the citizens are going to grow and grow, and so we are going to witness a lot of different examples of citizen assemblies. And I'm pretty sure that the Irish case is going to be quoted as the successful case, an example of things well done. But
thank you, Professor Garcia. So as a representative of Turkey, I'm going to be also commenting a little bit about the Irish country report. So it's a very clearly written and straightforward report, and I really learned a lot from it. So I had two comments. one has to do probably from coming from Turkey and seeing how referendums can also be misused and abused. I wanted to see whether the amendment making process has, the fact that it is obligatory to use referendums has actually made it less likely to be abused. So that was something, that was a question that I had in mind, because from the report that I got from the Irish report I got, and from Professor Stone's comment, this link between how politicians can actually use the citizens' assemblies, and also how they can use the citizen involvement to push for changes that they could not have achieved otherwise. I thought this was something that could be actually contradictory under a government that can be actually majoritarian, under a government that is more likely to be populist. So that was a comment that I had with respect to the Turkish case as well, in comparison to the Turkish case. And the second point that I had reading through the report was that, well, the fact that introduction of marriage equality through a referendum, through popular vote, could be something controversial from a comparative constitutional law perspective, on the sense that this is a matter that involves political rights and freedoms, and simply asking the people to be involved in a matter that could be regarded as, you know, rights and freedoms, and asking them to vote it down or up could be something controversial. And whether the use of referendums for matters that have to do with rights and freedoms is actually a good approach. This was a question that I had in mind reading through this. First of all, the possibility of misuse of referendums, and the possibility of misuse of citizen involvement to push for changes. And thirdly, the idea that asking the people to vote on matters that would be matters related to rights and freedoms, whether that's a good idea or not. So if Ireland has any comments as respect to whether this actually factored into the discussion during the referendum process, I would like to hear it, whether, you know, people actually considered that this was a way to go forward with rights and freedoms, asking the people to be involved. I wondered if that factored into the social debates in the media, among the politicians, among probably political scientists or constitutional lawyers, whether this was a debate they had. Okay, thank you.
Should I respond?
Yes, I'm genuinely curious whether this was an issue at all discussed.
Okay, yeah, I mean, a couple of them were about the questions are about the status of the referendum in Ireland and the way it's regarded. So let me try to tackle a couple of those at once. Yeah, it is mandatory that a referendum be used for any constitutional amendment. The Constitution does allow for voluntary amendments. In other words, if the government just thinks something's important, they're allowed to call a referendum. That, as far as I can tell, has not been used since the 1937 Constitution. In fact, the last time that we had a voluntary referendum, where the government was not required to call it but did anyway, was when it passed the 1937 Constitution itself. It's a funny story, so maybe I'll tell you the story. So Ireland enacts a constitution in 1922 when they get independence, the Irish Free State, and the constitution contained an elaborate constitutional amendment procedure, which I think included referenda. I'm not sure about that exactly, but it also had a provision that said that the government could amend the constitution for the first 5 years after the Constitution went into effect. They could amend the Constitution by a simple parliamentary majority. And it was meant to be just a cleanup thing. Okay, we probably missed something small. We can just take care of it that way. But what the thing is, among the provisions they were allowed to amend by simple parliamentary majority within the first 5 years was the provision that said that they could amend the Constitution for the first 5 years by simple parliamentary majority. So before the 5 years came up, they just said, why don't we just extend that another 5 years? So we can use simple parliamentary majority for another 5 years. And then when those 5 years went up, they said, why don't we extend it another 5 years? So when Eamon de Valera wanted to create a totally new constitution in 1937, in theory, he could have done so with a simple parliamentary majority. And he decided that would look really bad. So he decided, because he wanted his new constitution to have a greater legitimacy than that, he decided he would voluntarily to say this will be submitted to a popular referendum, which, by the way, passed with, I think, a smaller majority than either the marriage equality or the abortion referendum. I think the new constitution itself passed with like 58% of the vote or something like that. And I think both of the abortion and the same-sex marriage referendum took over 60% of the vote, I think. It has not always been used as an effective tool by the government. And I think that's probably related to this fact that, as you say, that it is mandatory. And so it's got in the government's way a couple of times. In the 60s, Fianna Fáil, which is historically the largest party in Ireland, tried to amend the electoral system. We have this very, we're the only one of the few countries that uses the single transferable vote to elect its parliament, which is a very proportional method. And Fianna Fáil is the largest party, and in fact, it's the only party in the entire history of the country that's ever been able to get a parliamentary majority in its own right. And so in the 60s, or late 50s, early 60s, they said, why don't we change the electoral system so it's first past the post, single member districts? Because they were the only one who would have any chance of getting a majority under that. And they knew that. And obviously all the other parties hated it. And Fianna Fáil had to take it to a referendum. And I think they tried it twice and they got voted down both times. So it was a definite break on the government and what they could do, in a move that was pretty shady, frankly, at the time. And the subject of the, is it controversial, this idea of submitting the rights and freedoms to constitutional vote? In my experience in Ireland, I wish there were other members of the delegation here. The specific requirement that all constitutional amendments have to go to referendum has not proven controversial in its own right. That might be because of the fact that there is no direct route at all to place something on constitutional amendment. It has to go through a parliamentary majority. Parliament must send it to the popular vote. So if you don't regard it as controversial that Parliament must rule on these matters, then you're not necessarily going to provide it to the referenda, because at most the referenda could provide a veto on a parliamentary move, as with the single member districts case. They can do that. They cannot. There is no way to bypass Parliament by initiative or anything like that. And I don't think there has been a particular concern about the referenda in this regard, with regard to rights and freedoms. It is true, like I said, that the constitutional ban on abortion got enacted through referenda, but that was at a time when abortion was illegal anyway in Ireland. It was already a ban, and it just didn't have constitutional status. So it's not like the normal political it's not like any other process would have. There was maybe a chance the judges and the Supreme Court might have been tempted to try to do an end run around the political establishment in this. Whether they would have gone so far as to just strike down the ban on abortion is pretty questionable, because that would have produced a huge backlash. They didn't even do that, and they produced a huge backlash. So I think in the Irish experience, there is very little. There's very little controversy over the appropriateness of the referendum. I think it would be very popular. I think it would be considered very unpopular to try to remove the requirement of the referendum in Ireland there. There's a lot else I could talk about, but let me maybe flag just one more issue, just in the issue of not of dominating the discussion. This is maybe a topic that's better addressed in the context of Spain, because I know it's relevant in Spain. One of the things that probably did make a large difference in the case of Ireland, as I said, is there was this kind of stratification along a number of dimensions. None of the dimensions, I think, would have been considered hot button kind of dimensions there, where there was a serious political cleavage there. There is a very serious political cleavage on the island, as you know, and that produced only one effect that I know of, which is when they had this convention on the Constitution, and they invited all of the political parties in the island to take part in the convention. The only parties that said no were the unionist politicians in the north. Those parties said, go away. All of the others, including especially Sinn Féin, of course, on both sides of the borders, were enthusiastic participants in it. But, could you have would anything like a citizens' assembly work, or any kind of for that matter, any kind of referendum procedure, any kind of deliberative procedure work across the border? That's a really good question, and that's being discussed quite a lot. There are ideas for this that maybe we can talk about, but at the date that nothing has been tried, and there's obvious reasons why it hasn't been. But of course, as you know, the Anglo-Irish Treaty says that if at any point the British government becomes convinced that a referenda in the north would support reunification, they are obliged to hold it. If they actually thought that a referendum on the north and south reuniting would pass. The danger of that referendum is it could be very, very, very non-deliberative. And so what could be done to make it deliberative if it ever happens, as Brexit might provoke it at some point? If anything will provoke it, Brexit will. Sinn Féin is making noises they would like to see that happen at some point. So if there are ways to try to head off the worst possibilities of how that could go, anything that could make the process more deliberative might be something worth thinking about. Maybe Irish experience speaks to that. By the way, I should just I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but just one more thing. I recently reviewed a paper about some kind of experiments with testing public opinion in Northern Ireland on the idea of citizens' assemblies and things like that, and are they a good idea? And I reviewed the paper, and I couldn't help remarking in my review. I said, it's interesting. You're doing a survey. You're talking to Northern Irish citizens about the possibility of a citizens' assembly. You're not even mentioning the fact that in the South they've been doing this a lot. There's literally no mention of the Republic of Ireland's experience with this at all. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there was a reason, because I think they know that mentioning, they do that in the South, that's going to push all kinds of buttons both ways on this. So for the moment in that conversation, they're leaving that out.
Thank you, Professor Stone, and thank you for your answers to the questions. So we have, we can actually go on with, I think, Spain being discussed by Austria and Bulgaria. I think we have participants for the three countries, if I'm not mistaken. So Professor Jimenez, would you be presenting the Spanish report?
I think it's better that Elena.
Okay, Elena. Okay. Sorry.
You deserve it.
No, I'm always talking. It's your turn, and I complement it with some things. But I think it's important to insist also in the peculiarities of the different constitutions. We are not speaking about the same type of norms and rules and contents. And I think it's very important to explain the specificities of the Spanish Constitution, in the sense that is very paradoxical, because it's based on a huge ideological consensus, but at the same is as open as to a lot of interpretations and changes that have been produced during a wide period. So I think the constitutional specificities are good, and I can add at the end something.
Okay, sure. So I go then with the constitutional details and the constitutional regulation. Also, what I want to highlight is that perhaps at the constitutional level at this moment, in relation to deliberation experiments and this, deliberative developments, we are not seeing so much, but at the level of the regions, we are going to see some examples of some regulations that are perhaps hidden that way. And also, I'm sure that Elena is going to go back to the most important element that was our debate, that is the theoretical debate. So let me explain you a little introduction to the constitutional amendment in Spain, and also more or less how was the process of the constituent process in Spain in 1978. So as Elena just has said, there was this huge ideological consensus after during our transition, and that is something that you can see how although it was a difficult process during although the process of drafting the constitution, it was short, but all started and it takes like three years until we we have the constitution. But the most important thing that to have to that in the moment that at that moment the deliberation, it was focused on the different political parties and opening dictatorship to a democratic regime during those years. And if we can check the different data about the referendum where the constitution was approved, and we are going to see that it was a huge support by the Spanish citizens. It's also something that is many times highlighted, that after the different election that we have from 75 to 78, so the constitutional referendum, the turnout was the lowest in that case. I think Elena correct me, but it was something like the 70% compared to the other electoral process that was huge. It was almost 90, more than 80%. But taking into account that after 3 years of intense electoral participation, it shouldn't be read as a datum. It's something that in some way the Spanish citizenry was exhausted after this long process. So what I want to highlight as well is that if we go to the Title 10, to the constitutional amendment procedures, as I said before, we have two. The most simple one that have been done twice so far, all of them related to the European Union. The last one in 2011, and in those cases we are going to see that the people does not participate directly. It is all happening in the parliament. It's true that it is needed a huge majority, 3/5 of the two chambers, and it's also that if there is at least 1/5 of the representative ask for a referendum, then we have to do it. But it's something that is the referendum must be asked by the members of the parliament. So when we have another more entrenched procedure, that is if we want to amend the preliminary title, the fundamental political decisions of our constitution, or if we want to have a full amendment of the constitution, or any amendment to the fundamental rights or to the regulation of the monarchy, then we need a very hard procedure that includes at the end the referendum. So as I was saying at the beginning, so far I know, and we were researching it for the poster and also for this for this report, that there are discussions about a national law, organic law statute to promote political participation, and this one is taking some of the developments that we can see in our regional constitutions. Remember that Spain is a devolved state in some kind. We don't say that it's a federal state, but there are some elements of a federal state. So if we go to the current statutes of autonomy, those of them that have been reformed, most of them include the right to political participation. It is true that at this level, it is not a fundamental right, a strong right that we can go to the courts and demand application of that right. It's more a guiding principle, but it commits the regional authorities. And if we go to some of these statutes of autonomies, then we are going to see that is a political right included, and some of them are talking about deliberative procedures, especially on those autonomous communities that has developed these political rights or any kind of law or statute. And then most of them usually include at least this kind of fora or citizens fora or citizen assemblies. We cannot give you at this moment empirical data, but we have doing some research about that, but we don't have found many experiences supported by these new laws. But what we can really found is a lot of experiences at a local level. I think I finished here, Elena.
So when we were thinking about the Spanish, there is something I would like to also stress about our constitution is that, you know, what has been always, you know, the biggest debate in all this transition process was the accommodation of the territorial claims. So this has influenced the Spanish politics and still is one of the most important debate, of course. And the second thing is very important because it's related to participation and how to conceive participation. This is important. That is, the terrorist claim and the independentist claim was a referendum for the independence. So the claim that they were defending is a referendum for self-determination. This is very important because in the collective imaginary, it has a lot of connotations that are there also when we are talking about participation. So in the moment the constitution was being approved, of course, it's not the same to elaborate the constitution in a transition moment than to make a kind of reform of the constitution in another moment. Of course, it was very difficult, and also it was not after a revolution or a big conflict. Is because Franco died in a context, of course, where there was a high polarized society in the sense that there were a lot of Frankists in general, but also a big opposition. And you know, when you see the numbers of Spain, you know that we are more or less half and half. It depends on more conservative and more progressive. That's the context, no? But it's when I discuss with constitutionalists, because I'm not a constitutionalist, and they allowed me to go to the seminars and to debate with them, but they say, well, in Spain we have just had 2 reforms of the constitution, 2 amendments of the constitution. The first is to change the vote for the when we joined in the European Union, and the second, this was very controversial because this was a very fast-track reform with no debate at all, not between citizens or between anybody. That was a fast change of Article 150 or yes, something.
135.
35, okay, 135. Because it was an exigence of the European Union to give the money to Spain when the crisis split. So it was an European requirement. They did it with a fast track that was very controversial because we really, for all these years of transition, we try not to reform the constitution because behind that was the territorial problem and also terrorism with their claims to make the referendum, etc. So there was a kind of agreement. But at the same time, the constitution was so open and included some progressive, the possibility of very progressive interpretations through the organic laws and through a lot of negotiations that were shown on the statutes of autonomy. That is a very important instrument, but because it has a constitutional status in a sense. The changes in the Spanish political system has been amazing, bigger than other constitutions that have been reformed for years with a lot of amendments. So this is one thing we need to insist on that. So we have introduced huge changes without amending the constitution due to different reasons. That's the first thing. And about deliberation, this is important because what we understand by deliberation has been changing also. When these theories started at the end of the 80s, more or less, the end of the 70s and developed in the 80s, deliberation was focused more on, understood as a theory of the legitimacy of democracy. So it was understood in the macro level. What was important, and I'm just referring Habermas, so that's why we quoted him on the paper, is the important thing is to create these public debates where, there are a lot of participations, but important institutional connections between what happened in society, the claims in society, the vindication, the fights in society, and the debates in society also, and the institutions. So there was this macro level, and after the possibility of applying the same principles for debating inside the institutions. So we were talking about deliberation in the tribunals, deliberation in the parliament, and we are measuring it, etc. But the basis was that. So in Spain, in the transition, the ones articulating the draft were very few politicians with a representative of their own parties, from communist to Frankist, and they were doing this draft. So it was, you know, a hard negotiation, but also deliberation. It was not just the negotiation. They were trying to accommodate, you know, which were the limits of each one, and trying to do something like this. But outside, there was a huge debate of society. You are very young, Adai, but you know, I was also young at that time. And we were speaking about this every day in the streets, in the schools, everywhere. So these are huge debates in society. Very, very important, in a very, very difficult context. So if you approach deliberation from this perspective, it changes your judgment. It's true that you didn't have an assembly with some citizens not affiliated. And also that we have to understand that the most important social representatives in that time, and in the context of this ideological polarization, there were the trade unions. The trade unions were considered at that time good representatives of the citizens, because the cleavage was also, the important cleavage was the social cleavage. This had changed with the time. So in the theory we have been evolving, the liberation is more focused on what? On, you know, the perspective of governance and the perspective of, you know, deciding about specific problems, you know, taking in consideration or taking in account all those affected, but they affected, directly affected by a measure. This is a very, very important change in the discourse of deliberation. But I think we have to keep in mind the other dimension. There are different dimensions of deliberation. We have to be aware in which dimension we are moving when doing our assessment of what we are doing. And the third moment is precisely the one that I was telling represents the Irish experience. You know, it started with this discourse on what they call democratic innovations, and it's a way of looking at deliberation that is focused on the individual citizens, not in social representatives and their presence in the committees, in the processes, but is focused specifically. So what they stress is the need for the citizens to directly participate on the processes of taking decisions, adopting decisions, etc. But and I finish with this. This is very important because when we are thinking on deliberation related to constitution, we need to be aware of different meanings, because otherwise it's impossible to interpret what happened, why they were pressing for some reforms and not others that were not considered important or key at this moment. And it's funny because, you know, I had a colleague that made his dissertation at the beginning of the 90s, and I quote it in our report. That is Pablo Oñate, is a professor in Valencia of political science, and precisely what he did is to apply Habermas theories on deliberation to the transition and the making of the constitution. And from this perspective, the judgment changed absolutely, and how we can assess this process also. And just to finish, you know which is the mechanism for participation, the favorite of the Spaniards? more than these small assemblies or these discussion or debate groups, the favorite mechanism for participation, and this is shown in the European analysis and comparative analysis, is demonstration. So the Spanish are the champions of going to the street and demonstrate, to push for measures, to give their opinions on the debates, and that has to be taken in consideration. So this is important.
Thank you so much. So we have Austria and Bulgaria to comment on the Spanish country report. Can I give the floor to Monica first, if it's okay?
Yes, you can. Thank you.
Thank you.
I try to be brief because I think we're very progressed in time. And in any case, the points I wanted to mention have mostly been mentioned by the two presenters. But I think what I liked in this Spanish report is that there are some lines along which we could compare the different countries with regard to deliberation as well as the constitution. And maybe just to point out that quickly here. So one thing is what also Elena mentioned now. So what do we mean when we talk about deliberation? Does it necessarily mean to include the citizens, or is elite deliberation also something we take into account? And when I come to the Austrian part, I will show that I have some examples, or one at least, of elite deliberation, but not including the citizens. So what is this then? So this is one thing. The other thing which I thought very important was to figure out or to describe in which situation this constitution was born, so to say. And what happens when you have a lot of conflicting parties and then you have to make a constitution. And this again is interesting, I think, in comparison with Austria, because the Austrian constitution, which is from 1920 in its core part, also was developed in such a situation of different political forces, which were very much controversial to each other, as well as a conflict between the nation state and the provinces. However, what came out of that was quite different, namely that a very few experts just wrote the thing, and everybody was excluded. Now we have 1920, we have 1978, so this is a huge difference, as we can see, but still I think it's interesting that out of a very similar situation, different forms of solutions can come out of that. So, and to link the constitution to the context, so to say. Then the third thing I thought, which was for me very enlightening, is the function and the impact of the constitution. So on the one hand, as Elena mentioned, that okay, you don't have to change the constitution in order to change a lot within the country. This go into the autonomy statute, for instance, as you mentioned. But on the other hand, what was in the paper, and you didn't mention it, that it is possible, in fact, to really revolutionarily change the constitution without terminating it. This is, I think, a rather specific treat. And then it's also the question if it is of importance, because the question is if anybody will do that, basically. And then with regard to deliberation, what I was thinking about, at what point or in which forms of crisis it is seen as appropriate to include in citizens' deliberation and when not. I mean, we have the Irish case where I said, okay, you said that the Celtic Tiger is basically just finished this idea, and we start up as including the citizens. We had the Icelandic example. In your case, you said precisely because there was such a lot of threats from different sides, it was not possible, or it was not seen as appropriate to include now the citizens to a large degree. So I guess it depends also if a crisis is like affecting the whole population in the same way, or it is felt like that, or if you say you have these crisscrossing conflict lines in a country. But I think this is also very interesting in which problematic situations we see it as interesting or positive or productive to have deliberation, and in which ones not. Something I mentioned briefly when we met between the working group leaders, that I think about that with regard to the COVID crisis, if it would make sense or if it happens that you include the citizens instead of imposing laws. That's a side step. And then obviously also what you mentioned a lot, the pressure to deliberation from below. And I think that when you said it's a lot about demonstrations, also with, in this constitutional procedure, okay, the citizens were not included, but still they discussed. And this, I think, is also different, probably due to political cultures, I would say. And the last point I want to make is that then again, the level of deliberation. So I think in several cases, you mentioned it in your paper for Austria, it's the same. We have lots more going on the level of the provinces or for you the regions or the terms or the municipalities than on the national level. And this again makes a huge difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I give the floor to Professor Chankova? You're going to be commenting, right, from Bulgaria?
Yes. Thanks.
Thank you.
Congratulations. It's a good report, very objective, very informative for me. Obviously, Spanish people are great writers as they are great speakers as well. However, I would like to mention only that I find very positive the fact that you have overcome, if I have understood you correctly, the elitist character of deliberation, which is not done in Bulgaria, for example, and only to mention that you are really lucky that you have a rigid constitution, because from my report, if I have time to make a presentation, you will see the arguments for this. Just one small question or clarification. In your report, I have seen a phrase that you said that there are announcements of the creation of citizen forums to debate some policies as sustainability, as well as to continue the debate of the future of Europe. So the crisis, it seems that the crisis, COVID and economic crisis, stimulate the public involvement. In Bulgaria, we are witness of the opposite phenomenon. The institutions suppress every public initiative, no deliberations at all at that moment. Emergency situation is used very efficiently for this purpose. And I would like to ask you how you have managed to achieve this in this crazy situation. Thanks. That's all.
Thank you. Spain, do you want to comment?
They have been, just to finish with this, because we just heard that this is almost developed. They are insisting now that they want a citizen assembly to think about the sustainability project of Spain. So linked to the Ministry of Environment and all these things, they are going to organize an assembly. It's very interesting because the ministry has a lot of colleagues from the academy and that we know, and they are going to develop these ideas. So they are pushing for this type. But also there was an announcement, I was not there, but 2 weeks ago, of the Ministry of Public Administration that linked to this is very interesting because in Spain, all this interest on creating these assemblies come, of course, from the period of the crisis, but more than everything from the cases, the huge cases and very scandalous cases of corruption. So they have during the crisis, they have established a link between, making organizing this type of forums and fight against corruption through the laws of transparency. Instead of being laws of transparency focused on the access to information, etc., they have included a lot of requirements to, in a way, to promote some types of participation. Because, as I said before, if you are following the discourses on participation, what was good quality and the participation to be developed has changed. That's why I'm insisting on that. So in one time, some parties and people tried to make things okay, but there were directed to some goals that now they seems like, you know, too elitist or something. So we had changed the discourse, and we have changed the lenses toward what is good participation. Because, for example, Monica adopted this vocabulary of the citizens and the elite. As I told you before, for years, trade unions were not considered any elite. They were the representative of the citizens. So the implication on the institutions, for example, in the Spanish constitution, they have a quasi-institutional constitutional status, the trade unions. They have a status through an organic law of a special representation of the citizens. So this was a model that was born from this more neocorporative state that saw these associations and these big associations in civil society as the right mechanism and instrument for citizen participation. What has changed is this discourse on elite, where you put everybody except what is called these ordinary citizens. So if you are, you know, an activist of an organization, but you know about politics and you are involved in politics, you belong to the elite immediately. And you can read it literally on this literature on these things. So this is what, you know, the point on which I disagree. So in these processes that takes decades, you apply now the lenses that many scholars are adopting to assess these processes from the perspective of deliberation. You have a different outcome than if you were thinking on deliberation at that time with that discourses of deliberation. That's a different assessment of what happened and that, no? So this is very interesting. So we are going to have, for the sustainability, we are going to have linked to changes in public administration for deciding some specific identified policy making. But the third one is, and we have introduced this as one of the contents of our working group that is important, is that Europe is especially interested on developing this type of initiatives at the national and regional levels or local levels to debate on the future of Europe. So we are going to see a lot of mechanism, you know, develop. And it's very interesting because they have made some essays before, the last year after Macron interest on making this consultation of citizens in all Europe. And I'm sure that our Turkish colleague or colleagues some countries in the East, they are going to be really worried about that, because if you read the reports of Hungary on the success of this citizens consultation, they are just, you know, concluding that the Hungarians have really said that they want to keep their sovereignty and that they are deciding, you know, on the issues of the European Union. So this is what I think in Turkey they're afraid of, that this type of assemblies can be also used to have a direct reference to the citizens that support, you know, instead of having this mediation of these elites and intermediaries, the direct participation of citizens that supports these more authoritarian terms.
Okay, thank you. So if we may, we can move forward with Bulgaria, because we have both the presenter. I mean, we don't have a commenter from Moldova, but Spain can, of course, comment on Bulgaria's case. So, okay. So we have the presentation. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay. I hope I will be able to navigate the PowerPoint, but thank you, Jonathan, in any case, for your help. So we have, I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation not to torture you, and to have you also something in writing. Maybe you have not time to read the great Bulgarian report. We have entitled this report, The Long Bulgarian Journey to Deliberative Democracy, and you will see why. Jonathan, next slide. Yeah, these are the introductory remarks that I should skip because I have already spoken about this, but just to mention that the other Bulgarian representative, Dubrinka Pejcheva, Professor Pejcheva, also have participated in the elaboration of the report. Next slide is dedicated to the first section, historical overview. This maybe I should skip more or less, only to mention that we have a long history with the constitutionalism in Bulgaria, not really so great as I would like, but the Turnovo Constitution should be mentioned as the first one, democratic constitution. And after the long period and the collapse, socialist period and the collapse of the totalitarian communist regime, the things changed, radically. Next, please. We differentiate three ways of democratization, which have their implications on constitution making and also deliberative democracy. First wave after tender revolution, the second way, the second period of democratization connected with the establishment of the representative democratic institutions, and the third wave of democratization, nowadays, by the way, related to the full membership, to the EU and NATO, and the adoption of more open and inclusive model of representative institutions and development of deliberative practices. This is not so essential. Next, please. Theoretical and constitutional consideration, 2 slides, I will totally skip because we share the general theory of the concept. So nothing new from our side, only just to familiarize you with the primary forms of civic participation during the last decades in Bulgaria. As you see, this is a mixture between direct and representative democracy, participatory democracy instruments, maybe nothing new for you, but we are feeling obliged to report. Next slide, please. The next section of our report is dedicated to legal regulation of forms of civic participation. The legal the main instruments are the Constitution of Bulgaria, specific law on the direct participation of citizens in state authority and local self-government, which also regulate more or less deliberative practices, also law on meetings, rallies and manifestations, and some other statutory acts, rules and regulations. Next, please. The constitutional dynamics. Here, maybe it's a little bit more attention deserved. We have a constitution which is a stable act, but nevertheless, so far it has been revised 6 times, 4 times in relation to the Bulgarian accession to EU, and the last 2 revisions in relation to the reform of judiciary, which is highly contested terrain in Bulgaria. The next slide, please, Jonathan. Here. In the report, we prepared overview of the last initiatives, more or less related with deliberative democratic practices. The 3 referenda, as you see, for the construction of a new nuclear power plant, remote vote referendum, referendum on electoral system change. The 3 unsuccessful, discussed in the parliament, not taken into account. So that's the situation with these deliberative practices, democratic practices. Next, please. The most developed practices, however, are, as you all know very well, as maybe everywhere, public advisory council, electronic public consultation portal, public register for referenda, national citizen initiative. We have active public organizations also. So on the theory, everything is perfect. But next, let's see. We have also identified some problems and challenges in relation to deliberative democracy and constitution making in Bulgaria, and this is most important part of the of my report. For example, just to briefly inform you about some of them, we have, yes, public consultation portal, but only some drafts are published there selectively, with delay, with inconvenient for deliberations summertime. The most important acts, strategies, including, for example, are not there. And not always the results of public consultations are published, and what is most important, not are taken into account. And this you will hear several times from me. Next, please. The same happened with the other public consultation in legislative process, working group developing important acts with participation of experts, NGO leaders, etc., which present good, sound arguments, but their opinion is not always counted. And sometimes they are quite surprised by the final version adopted. Next, please. The latest and greatest, maybe, this is the constitutional reform in Bulgaria as an ongoing process is continuing, although in a highly controversial way, I dare say. Still unsolved is a long-lasting problem with the accountability of the Prosecutor General, despite several bills and Constitutional Court decisions from this year, despite the Council of Europe, Venice Commission, and EU Acts notes on this. Next, please. There is also, that one. There is a recent initiative for amendments of the constitution belonging to the Bulgarian president, started last year, which continued this year, but the president, for many reasons, decided not to submit the draft in the current parliament. This draft was consulted with the academia, NGO, and broad audience, I would say. Next, please. This is not the case now. The latest development, the very, very latest development, regrettably marks a deviation from the standard democratic principles. And definitely you are well acquainted with the turbulent situation in Bulgaria, including 3-month street anti-governmental protests, also claiming for resignation of the Prosecutor General. And this is maybe the most important. In August this year, somewhat surprisingly and without any public deliberations, the ruling political party submitted to the parliament a brand new draft constitution in response to the public criticism about the political system and its functioning. The draft is not made available to the broad public yet, but will be discussed in the parliament, and this is draft constitution. A special commission was established, but the president made an inquiry to the Constitutional Court about its constitutionality. The decision is expected. I think it is a warning. This moment is important. Next, please. Next slide, please. Next slide I will skip, except the fact that the EU, the European Commission, etc., really advised the Bulgarian government to take note on civil society acts, but no response at that moment. Next, please. Maybe this will be of interest for you. For the purpose of this report, a small-scale survey about the state of art and prospects of constitution making and deliberative democracy in Bulgaria was launched by academics in September and October this year. And the respondents, among them law and sociology students, university faculty members, representatives of NGOs, public institutions, filled out a questionnaire. And although the results could not be considered representatives, they are quite indicative. Next, please. You will see, I will not read all slides, but you see the question number 1 about the familiarity with the concept of deliberative democracy. 56% a negative answer, so not very popular in Bulgaria. This should be changed immediately. Not a very good sign for us as a democratic society. Next, please. Yeah, here there is a more positive picture, because the respondents, however, rightly associate the efficient deliberative democracy practices with public debate, civil initiatives, e-portals, the role of media, and there, of course, are some criticism about the efficiency of any deliberative practices in the country. Next, please. Again, have you participated in deliberative formats? We have asked the participants, and only 26% have taken part. The rest, 74%, have no experience. Much more encouraging are the answers of the question about their willingness to participate. 90% are positive, only 6 are negative, and 4 have no opinion. Next, please. Some more general questions have been posed, but I think they are indicative. What should be changed so that citizen rights and civil society interests are better respected in Bulgaria? As you see, legislation, public politics, implementation of laws, accountability of public institutions, the respondent says. Next, please. Thus, the latest initiative, which I already mentioned, for the adoption of a new constitution meet your approval? The majority, 68%, give a negative answer, grounding on the thesis that the operative constitution envisages enough instruments. The problem is in their proper implementation. But also a big part answer positively. However, even those respondents do not accept the model accepted without any public deliberation to be adopted a new constitution. Next and final question, please. Is it necessary in a potential new constitution to be given a more weight to the civic society actors in the decision-making process? As expected, a vast majority say yes, 82%, only a tiny minority say no, and could not decide 10. Plus some other extra argument. Next, please. The new perspective, which is also the part of our report, I am presenting the report. The next section is dedicated to the new perspective, which in Bulgaria, according to us, according to most experts, is e-democracy. And I would like to mention that we have already had a successful social experiment, deliberative forum Megdan. Megdan is an archaic Bulgarian word of a synonym of the Greek agora. So this we have already had in Bulgaria, the agora as a meeting place. Plus some other deliberative networks in Bulgaria. Yeah, we have. And the next, please, maybe final one. The next slide, please. Yeah, our conclusion is yes, that with deliberative democracy, maybe we will not decide everything, but in any case, the knowledgeable society believes in this concept, in these practices, despite the risks of misuse also, which happens even nowadays. And although partially we have some positive results, for development of civil society in Bulgaria. And the final, thank you for your attention. One Bulgarian rose.
Thank you. Can I please ask Spain to comment briefly on the Bulgarian country report? Whoever wants to.
Anna, you can start.
Or if anybody has comments.
No. So let me just say thank you to Professor Shankova and all the Bulgarian team. It is a very comprehensive report, and it's something that I started to see how to perhaps to see again the Spanish report and to develop some things. For example, I think it's quite interesting the historical survey that you talk a little bit about the history of the Bulgarian constitutionalism, something that we didn't do, that we just focus on the last constitution in the 1978, although the deliberative term is quite recent, but we can try to see from that point of view the rest of constitution in Spain as well. And but what I want to ask you is just please understand me as a constitutional lawyer, my obsession with constitutional amendment procedures. Something that you say that there was 6 amendments so far, and you said that it's not a very rigid process, and I suppose that there is no referendum at all, and that the people does not participate directly. Just if you can develop that as well. And also just a very brief comment in relation to your survey that I think is very, very interesting to organize that with your colleagues in Bulgaria. That obviously is not a comfort comment or a comfort answer, but as soon as I start in this cost action, and I always try to, when we start to explain the Spanish Constitution, also we explain the concept of democracy, the representative democracy, and then I usually try to speak a little bit about deliberative democracy. And it happens the same with our students. It is true that I teach in a law school, and just to law students and to labor relationship students, but for most of them, any project, any experience related to deliberative democracy usually is less than 20%. So this is perhaps not something just Bulgaria, but this can be quite wide in whole Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, very briefly, I'm going to focus on the first part, the theory. And I think that explains why our students, they don't know very well about deliberative democracy. I teach students from the Faculty of Law, but they specialize on political science. And it's the same problem. So my teaching is to explain what is behind the levels of representative democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, direct democracy, because in the introduction, and it's what I was defending in our group, you know, theory is mixed, and there is a confusion on what are we speaking about. There is not a contradiction or an opposition. Our models are all representative. So depending on the meaning of these concepts that we are using, you are referring to some things on the other. And I'm going to give you an example, because in the questionnaire, but also in many of the comments, and in the imaginary of the people when they are thinking on generally on deliberation and citizen participation, etc., they are more focusing on civil society and the participation of organization, etc. But we as we saw before now in the discourse, they are trying to apply deliberation to some assemblies where there are some citizens that are not representative in that sense. We have changed, and we are now using this language of the elite and civil society associations and representatives in this discourse for part of the elite, but not when you are just trying to ask in the more ordinary language, etc. When you are asking the people, they give to civil society, especially, particularly in the Eastern countries, because all the discourse on the transitions for the East countries was based on this important role of civil society, and And in the, as I say, in the Habermasian imaginary and the first deliberatives and many other very well-known authors, it was, all the discourse was based on the so important role of these civil society organizations on promoting deliberation and improving the quality of democracy and being a vehicle for the transition. So I think we need to go deeper to this debate. Of course, we are not going to solve these contradictions or the mixtures in the use of the terms, but it's important to acknowledge that, because the assessment of the things, and when you are explaining deliberation, you have to take in account that, because otherwise it's a little confusing, no? Not a little, a lot, even for us as teachers to teach the students. And it's interesting for me because you say that suddenly government has sent a draft during the summer, a draft of the whole new constitution.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's amazing.
Amazing, amazing, amazing.
But you said, and this is more amazing, that nobody knows about the content. But in the moment a draft or a project comes to the parliament, they have the duty of publishing it. So they have few days, at least, in our parliamentary procedures, that has to be public. It's impossible not to have this public, no? So this is really terrible and shocking for our institutional culture.
That's correct. Only brief answer. Yesterday I checked. It is not officially in the parliament. I have found the draft on the political party website, which is not enough, in my opinion.
So you really have to follow it seriously and really to try to fight to create this, at least a deliberative debate on Bulgaria, of course.
Thank you. Dear Monica, we don't have a commentator from Moldova, but maybe you want to present your country report? I was told by Jonathan that we have more time, so no worries.
I will share my screen.
Thank you.
It's not good what I'm doing here. Just a second. Yeah, I try to be brief because I think I could be even briefer by saying that somehow. What is this now? Sorry. This doesn't work. So. Yeah. Okay, because basically I could also say that Austria is somehow not well situated in this cost project, because basically we cannot change the constitution by deliberative methods. So I will not be that brief. Anyway, Austria is a representative democracy and has a very, very strong representative part. It's also a federal state consisting of 9 provinces. However, the federalism is rather weak. So in fact, in many cases, one could say it's a centralist state. We have a 2-chamber system in the parliament, and also here you see the weakness of federalism, because the National Council holds exclusive competencies for legislation and administration, and the Federal Council, representing the provinces, only holds residual competencies. And we have, and I thought about that when Elena was talking, political parties play a huge role, and historically it was also a kind of mirror of class relations, to put it like that. Obviously this has changed. There are now more political parties, still to a very high degree they structure the political landscape, for better or worse. And we have also something which is called social partnership, where you have the representatives of the employers and the employees. Also here I thought, when you talked about the trade unions, which basically stabilized the country for a very long time. So it meant negotiations. It didn't mean like struggling, it meant negotiations. Both parts, the political party part and the social partnership, are declining in importance, but still play a role. We have, and this is similar as in Bulgaria and everywhere, so I will do it like for the Bulgarian case very briefly, go through that. So we have the possibility of referenda, popular petitions, and popular consultations on the national level. So there's also only 3 possibilities. And we had very few, especially of the referenda. I mean, very few is good. We had 2 of them. and we had one popular consultation. The popular petitions are the only thing where the citizens by themselves can initiate the procedure, and if you have more than 100,000 signatures, then it has to be dealt with in parliament, which doesn't mean a lot. They can say we are not interested. We had more of these popular petitions, and the same instruments are available in most provinces and in most cities, municipalities. As this is a debate in Austria, that there's a few possibilities for the population to really take part. There was a study commission of the parliament called Strengthening Democracy in Austria in 1415. And there were several proposals about administrative reform and whatever. Two things I think which are important, at least for participatory democracy, not so much about deliberation. One is that a popular petition which is signed by 10% of the population, which is a whole lot, would automatically lead to a referendum. So not only go to the parliament, but automatically lead to a referendum. This was not implemented after the study commission. It was then promised by the former government, which was the right-wing populist government plus the conservatives, for the end of the legislative period. Now, as you might know, this end was never reached due to the famous Ibiza scandal. So it was not implemented by this government. And interestingly, I think our current government, which consists of the Conservatives and the Green Party, doesn't mention citizen participation at all in the program. It's just not there, which is kind of interesting because the Greens always had this with basic democracy and whatever have you. And one thing which was implemented after the study commission was that legislative proposals are public on the site of the parliament. So this is what Elena now mentioned, no, with regard to Bulgaria. So you can look at that and you can write a comment. If something is done with this comment, depends on what they want to do. But in a way, it's interesting because you include somehow the citizens at an early stage in terms of also giving a vote, so giving your opinion. Now coming to the Austrian constitution, I mentioned that already. The core part comes from 1920, from a situation with many conflicts. And what happened is that basically it was written by experts, especially one expert, Kelsen, and it is a purely constitution. So there is nothing about values, there's nothing about aims, it is purely procedural. This was the solution to not get into these conflicts on the one hand. On the other hand, one has to say that Kelsen was a huge fan of this kind of constitution. It was his idea of democracy to say the outcome should not be prescribed by the constitution. The constitution has been amended more than 130 times, and this core part is only part of 500 laws which are part of the constitution, which basically means that nobody knows what is part of the constitution, and it has no, of course, no, I mean, and it has no symbolic value also, no, it's quite different to the American constitution. It's like, yeah, and really, I mean, I think even lawyers have to look up if this is now on constitutional level or another level, so this constitution. For this, because this is seen partly as a problem, I mean, it's ambiguous. Some people say it's great because it's just the procedures, but others says it's a ruin. So there was an Austria convention in 2004-05 with the idea to devise fundamentally the constitution. As said before, this was a deliberative body without citizen representation. So you had the government, the high courts, we don't read everything. A lot of institutions were there. Civil society organizations were invited to present their ideas, but they were not really part of that. And by the end of the day, also this, like also this democratization initiative didn't lead to a lot. The only thing which was really changed, which is important, is that the voting age was lowered to 16 years. So the constitution has stayed as it was. There were two kind of conflicting, also kind of forms of protest against this form of deliberation without citizens, a citizen convention and a youth convention, which were informal, coming out from citizen initiatives. The parts of the Austria, some people, representatives of the Austria Convention, took part in these conventions and somehow knew then what was discussed there, but it didn't have any kind of official impact. We have no possibility to change constitutions, neither on the federal level, neither on the provincial level, on the basis of citizens' deliberations. We have some institutionalized forms which are more or less the same as everywhere, and this is very slowly increasing. So there are recommendations now even on the national level on how to do that. But this is also, it's a very broad understanding of public participation, informative, consultative, and cooperative. We have in 2 provincial constitutions participatory democracy mentioned and implemented in 2 provinces. We have youth councils, we have participatory budgeting in some places, and a local agenda which is about sustainability and districts of cities or stuff like that. There are also one-time deliberative procedures on different levels, then also initiatives by NGOs and civil society, and we have 2 or 3 forms of publishing that, and as far as I know, these publications are okay. One is participation.at, and the cities of Vienna and Graz publish which upcoming participatory exercises they have for the citizens. So that's it. And what I was thinking when I was listening to your reports is that I think one reason for that is also that, okay, we have this traditional system as it is, and there's not a lot of pressure by the citizens to have more of these procedures. So it's also from both sides is kind of accepted that this is a representative democracy and this is as it should be. Good.
Sorry, I said thank you, Monica. Ireland, do you have comments on the Austrian country report? You're also muted.
Right. Just a couple of comments. I'll be brief. I mean, by coincidence, this arrived for me in the mail today here. So I didn't have time to read it before making my comments now, but it's very high on my list of things. There's a couple of things there. I think this is kind of interesting because Austria is probably one of the cases where there is the clearest historical understanding that representation of citizens happens through certain established channels, that people have certain identities and that those are the identities that count for purposes of politics. And if you are represented as a member of that identity in the classic kind of corporatist way, then you are represented there. And so, I mean, I guess, and the entire random selection approach in a lot of ways, the citizens' assemblies and all of that, is kind of almost, the direct opposite of this. I mean, and I think maybe I'd be interested in Elena's opinion on this, but I mean, even in the cases where stratification happens, I think with most of these citizen assemblies, as far as I know, there is pretty much no effect or no systematic effect of people thinking of themselves as, well, I'm on this council as a woman, or I'm on this council as a member of the working class, or anything like that. People don't think of themselves. Maybe they think of themselves as taking ideas from their friends or their constituents who are maybe of the same socioeconomic class or whatever, but they don't see themselves as there as to bargain on behalf of any kind of group, the way in the kind of classic electoral kind of corporatist route you'd expect to see. And it's interesting to maybe in that regard to ask the questions, I guess, in both ways. One is what can lead to the kind of the pathological cases, you could say, I'd call them pathological, when assemblies do start to think of themselves this way, citizens' assemblies, and then what the other way around within more traditional legislative institutions, what can open up a space for deliberation that isn't just based on specific predefined identities. I know in the first question, I don't think any of the Australians have been involved with this meeting here, but I know that was one of the cases where some of the biggest concerns was raised about this, because I think it was in New South Wales, there was a citizens' assembly around the siting of nuclear waste dumps, with whether New South Wales is going to allow for nuclear waste dumps within there, and the perception of the Citizens' Assembly, rightly or wrongly, I gather, was tainted because people, the perception was, I don't know how accurate this was, but the perception was that there was a well-formed anti-nuclear caucus within it. That is, the anti-nuclear people found each other and they actively worked together to try to ensure that the Citizens' Assembly would reach a no nukes decision. And that, I mean, and like I said, I don't know enough to know how accurate that was, but in many ways it kind of torpedoed a lot of the credibility of the institution because it wasn't perceived, you know, the legitimacy, the credentials of the institution depended upon this idea. Again, I think that this is not a group of people who are there as representatives of established groups, that they were there to just have a free deliberation coming from their different perspectives. And the minute you undermine that perception, you undermine the perception of the institution. So I throw that out there in some ways. It's kind of an open-ended question there, but to sort of say, like, you know, those kind of considerations are maybe worth keeping in mind as you think from the opposite perspective of when you have a corporatist kind of arrangement, what kind of arrangements, what might be the spaces for opening it up, especially given, I mean, as you say, you know, the arrangement is persisted, but it is under greater strain right now than it ever has been. And it's precisely because of the fact that I think there are certain categories that people that are just not going to fit, and that has opened up this kind of populist space, which, and you know, I mean, if anything, populism is another way to radically challenge that. And I guess maybe maybe I'll make that my final remark to be thinking about, is the extent to which I think often you hear citizens related initiatives described as populistic, but for me at least, the kind of the approach of the citizens' assemblies to deliberative mini publics and the approach that represents is like the polar opposite of the populist kind of option there. I mean, to me, they're black and white. So I would be curious if that is the perception in Austria, and whether or not that's you would take that to be an accurate characterization. So with that, I'll just leave it there.
Maybe if I can just answer very briefly. I know we are running out of time.
No problem. We have until 5 o'clock.
Okay.
Time.
Okay, fine. Then I don't have to talk so quickly. No, I absolutely agree with you, Peter, and I think you phrased it very well. And obviously, on the one hand, this identification with political parties decreased. So what we see is precisely that, especially I would say, those who felt represented by the Social Democrats don't feel so any longer, and that this goes to the populist right. We have, as I said, very few experiences with deliberations, with really assemblies. But I would think that in general there you don't have like this caucus, or that somebody is really representing. I think what we have to differentiate here are referenda from these deliberative settings. And in referenda, as far as I saw that, populists, mostly from the right, but also from the left, I mean, they have a very good chance then, you know, to simplify matters in a way that people are really driven to say yes or no. So, and I think this is, so when we talk about participatory democracy, I guess this is something we have really to split up, and then to see also if before a referendum we had some public sphere, which can involve citizens should, but maybe doesn't even have to, but some discussion which leads then to a more informed decision. I don't say a rational, but a more informed one. And for this, we have examples that referenda really went in a completely erratic, because I would also say we have no experience with that. It's not like in Switzerland where people are used to do that.
Could I just add one comment here?
Sure,
I mean, one experience that might then be very pertinent here be if you're familiar with the Citizens Initiative Review in Oregon there that John Gastill has pioneered, because that is meant to provide a non-partisan deliberative body which provides guidance or a report, basically, which is available to the citizens who are voting on referenda in Oregon. And there is evidence that a very, not a majority, but a good number of people read it and these reports, and that they do have an impact there, just in terms of keeping people informed, so they have more than they have more than a simplified message, in other words, there.
Okay.
Can
Yes,
I say
please.
something?
No, please, Elena, go ahead.
Yes, two things to Monica is really interesting, you know, and this is something that we have to take in consideration, the differences between constitutions, because it's, of course, this Kelsenian is a constitution like empty of contents, and the opposite we could say of our Spanish constitution that was full of contents, but you can pick up a little bit, no, and you could defend within the same framework more progressive and more socialist, I would say, policies, but also conservative. So, but this is very important because the legitimacy of the constitution also is based on that. Really, if the framework allows, you know, to have these different positions, it's not so necessary to focus on the reforms. And it's interesting because when we joined the European Union, and I think, and this is something I defend against my constitutionalist colleagues, this is a major reform of the constitution, not formally done. We did it through a tricky article that we had in the constitution that was like, you know, it was intended to precisely to join the European Union. So we didn't have to introduce any reform through, it was the 93, is the 93 or the 95? I never remember, alike. So there was an article that allowed us to enter the European Union. And this is a major transformation of our constitutions. Even for constitutionalists, they don't take care of that. Some of them, at least, and I am sure you do. But they say no reforms, and I say this is a major reform. But this is very interesting because in the middle of the economic crisis, you know, some of the constitutionalists and the colleagues, when they refer to this fast reform of the Article 135, they say this is really a mutation of our constitution, because precisely something that seems to be like something formal was against these contents included on the constitution. This is very, very interesting for me, that point in comparison with other constitutions. And I'm going back to Peter because I think I don't want you to misunderstand me, because I'm in favor of these mechanisms, and I think precisely that they go against these discourses, populist discourses, or this management of referendums. But we have to be careful with this, because all these mechanisms are directed to re-legitimate the politics for the citizens. What is a way, I think is not the right way to think on that, is that they are going to change the representative structure, because we are in a democracy that is based on different representations of the citizens. And when you are using these strategies, you are selecting the citizens that are going to be representative of the citizens with other strategies and other mechanisms. This is very important to say. And this is representative democracy. But what I'm against is on the this huge use of this division, the citizens and the elite, in our own discourse when thinking on this mechanism, and also when you are just opposing to representative democracy a lot of the models of levels of democracy. And I'm going to give you an example. You assume, or many scholars, or in your comments, you were assuming that, you know, when you force or help the citizens that have no affiliations to deliberate, they are going to be free of some interest that you presume they have, the politicians and members from the political party. I have the chance to be in the parliament, working for the government for 3 years, and I was following all these debates on the parliament. What is, for example, something shocking is that in a very, very Catholic country as Spain, on the debate of the abortion, that was really, really a sensitive issue. both main parties, the socialists and the popular parties, they had deputies that didn't want to change the law or to touch anything. So they have inside the parties, they have their own debates. So around this, as around the gay marriage and as around other issues that are very, very important issues, there is inside the parliament and inside the parties, there are also important debates. It's not that they just follow some instructions and they have to all be, around that. But I think preferences, also the citizen preferences, are a construction, and there is a kind of process that is bidirectional. So in assuming this, I think we should be careful just adopting this view so simplistic of how the parties, are just fixed on their positions. Inside the parties, there's nothing else, and they are just following some instructions, because this is much more complex. One thing after is the vote, but also the deliberation and the decisions are more complex. So what I'm defending is a more nuanced way of opposing these things, or just suggesting the equilibriums, etc. So that's a little bit my position. So I don't want to be misunderstood, because I'm in favor of that, and I've been promoting citizen participation, but I don't share some of the discourses. And I think we have to be very careful, because after, in many countries, when you organize this type of forums at the local level, the regional level, and you just invite the citizens and you create that, and a lot of people, in a lot of places, they have spent a lot of money on that. They are irrelevant, and the other citizens, they don't understand that, they are participating directly, or they don't feel that they are representing them in any case. So we have to be careful, because the context also and the issues on debate, etc., changes a lot, the outcomes.
Thank you. So I know that many people didn't get a chance to take a look at the Turkish report, so I'll just summarize how we approach this. So we present the Turkish case as one of majoritarian imposition. So the current constitution, which was drafted in 1982, was written in the aftermath of a military coup, and since then it has been amended 19 times, and this has 5 of these involved obligatory referendums, and before that there have been 2 instances of holding a referendum, and both of these cases were in the aftermath of drafting a constitution which was controlled by the military. So the 1961 constitution as well as the 1982 constitutions were approved by a referendum, and both of these constitutions were written in the aftermath of a military coup. So the current constitution, as I said, has been amended 19 times. 5 of them have been 5 of them with a referendum, and in all of these cases, it was a constitutional proposal that was drafted and approved under a single-party government. So I think this presents a trend in which we see that when there is a single party that is not able to muster the 2/3 majority, it's rather pushes for a constitutional referendum that is stamped with the approval of the popular vote. So in the country report, you will see that we explain that there are 2 paths of constitutional change, formal constitutional change, and one involves 2/3 majority and the other involves 3/5 majority. And the 3/5 majority require that the people actually ratify the constitutional change. So our position is that this has allowed for majority imposition to take place and has actually removed proper deliberation with regard to constitutional change. The only instances where we have genuine deliberation, that was that was elite deliberation. This took place during the 1990s and early 2000s within the context of EU reforms. And there have been multiple amendments during this process, but most notably in 1995 and 2001, these amendments actually pushed for, let's say, removing some of the authoritarian aspects of the constitution and expanded rights and freedoms. And in all of these cases, there was actually a commission that was founded as an ad hoc body, where every political party was represented regardless of how many seats they had in the parliament, and these were able to continue deliberation and then pushed for constitutional changes that were adopted with 2/3 majority as opposed to 3/5. So the parliamentary deliberations have been able to provide for greater consensus, expansion of rights and freedoms, as opposed to the recent changes that were approved within the parliament, but under a single party, and then stamped with the approval of a referendum, but did not actually lead to a consensual constitutional making. It was actually very polarizing, the 2007 amendments, the 2010, and the recent 2017 amendments, which actually transformed the political regime from one where the parliament was quite strong to one which is quite dominated by the executive. So the use of referendums have been quite polarizing and have led to majority imposition. So with that in mind, there is only one opportunity for citizen involvement, and that is the referendum, and that is the formal way to involve the citizen deliberation. But during 2011 and 2013, there was let's say, an opportunity to involve greater deliberative democracy, and that was when an initiative took place to completely overhaul the constitution, and that's followed the same mechanism that I described, this ad hoc body, but this was more, let's say, institutionalized in the sense that they established their own rules of procedure, which included a unanimity rule. So every political party that was represented in this body had to approve the changes. But that actually resulted with deadlock on a number of issues, and this constitutional conciliation body was able to only agree on 60 articles and was terminated afterwards. But this also involved an informal mechanism to involve deliberation, and this was actually spearheaded not by the commission itself, but a civil society platform that organized 15, if I'm not mistaken, 15 or 13 meetings across the country, where from 500 to 1,000 people did actually participate. And they talked about many issues on the table, but none of the inputs were actually summarized or shared with the public, and they were not necessarily incorporated into the drafting of the new constitution or the drafting of the planned new constitution. So after completing this deliberation across the country, basically they haven't taken any extra effort to summarize them, to incorporate them, or even to use them as a way of referencing to the changes that they want to promote. So this was, I would say, the only citizen deliberation that was attempted besides the use of referendum. So and since the transformation in 2017, constitutional politics have become much more, let's say, confrontational. As it is today, the constitution remains as, I would say, a parchment, in the sense that the governing structure has become quite arbitrary, and the lower courts are not in compliance with the constitution or with the constitutional court. So the constitution, as it was accepted in 1982 and transformed 19 times, is still in force, but I would argue that it is not necessarily in exercise. So that kind of summarizes the Turkish constitutional politics and dynamics in the recent years. Thank you. So I'm not sure who was going to comment on the Turkish case. Oh, Ireland. Did you have time to take a look? But if anybody has any comments, I think all would be appreciated.
I mean, I took a brief look at
Yes.
it, but I mean, this sounds a bit. It does sound a bit like the Austrian experience, where the history of deliberative constitution is just no, and that's kind of how it is. So that's fair enough, you know, as far as reports. And so I guess maybe the most productive way of thinking about it is in terms of possible intervention, possible spaces for deliberation within the constitutional project. And this is, I guess, Turkey is probably the most extreme case of the ones where deliberation could be seen as a partial remedy for some of the failings of the democratic process, because I'd say as far as failings go, Turkey's probably fallen further than any of the other countries that's been talked about so far there. So it is worthwhile, and maybe that's relevant. The main experience you mentioned that's relevant is that the conciliation body that you mentioned, which sounds like it was geared much more towards the traditional representation of interests there, and what can establish parties, as opposed to what can people who are not tied to any particular interest agree upon. So I don't know if there is any tradition of that or any experimentation like that, but it would be interesting to know or to reflect whether something like that might be possible.
Yeah, well, the way that they organized it, the deliberation that does not include only political parties was either through submission of proposals by mail, let's say by mail, as well as by email through a website. But again, that was up for people to see, but none of that was taken into consideration when the time came to actually write the drafts. And the 60 articles that they ended up agreeing on didn't necessarily deviate from the way that the constitution was already amended. So it hasn't necessarily been led to any improvements. And in the end, none of these 60 articles were actually taken into consideration and passed as constitutional change. Just in opposite, the ruling party's preferences, which was a change to a presidential system, and this was what led to this conciliation body to collapse, passed as a result of a referendum in 2017. So what they could not achieve through the conciliation body, they could do so because they had a majority in the parliament and because they could muster the 50% approval in a referendum. So I would argue that the referendum process has been misused, and the citizen deliberations, when they turned out to be not beneficial, have not been necessarily supported by the government or by the other political parties. So now there is a talk of what would happen if there was a transition, let's say in 2023, if there is a change in government, if there's a change in leadership, would it be possible for Turkey to actually reverse back to a parliamentary system? And if such transition were to occur, I think the Spanish case presents the best example for Turkey to follow. But other than that, there is no tradition of, let's say, citizen participation in constitution making. Even the previous ones that I did not discuss, the 1921, the 1924 constitutions, which are like, I would say, for war period as well as nation building period, these were passed in the parliament with no contributions from outside, dominated by, let's say, political elites and not necessarily representative. So there is no precedent for deliberation that is not elite dominated.
It's kind of it's a little bit interesting in that the Irish experience, because of course Ireland's original constitution, you know, it comes out of a transition. It's when Ireland gets independence, but it's a case where the constitution is basically written by one side on the polarization. There, you have the Irish Civil War, and the Civil War is entirely over whether to accept the terms of independence or not. There, and so the losing side not only was not part of the process, but I mean went to war, and then after they lost the war, they actually they ran for elections in the parliament and actively boycotted them for pretty much a decade. And it wasn't until the dominant party made I'd say, questionable decision to basically compel them that, like, you know, you forfeit the seats if you don't actually show up. Then they started showing up, and then of course soon thereafter the anti-treaty side wins the majority and they become the dominant party. So that was somehow a case where despite the Constitution being written one side in this polarized setting, this doesn't lead to an endless cycle of recriminations or whatever. Both sides do find a way of reconciling to it. So, you know.
I have more a question than a comment, in the sense that which are the uses of democracy that are being used on the country? Because in
uses of democracy, you said, right?
Yeah.
Electoral process, and that has been tainted with electoral fraud quite often in the last couple of elections, or interference.
Yeah, I mean, for example, we heard Orban deciding that illiberal democracy was better for Hungarian to adapt global. For wonder, which is this the uses of this, you know, legitimate the uses of democracy, and you know, I follow more or less the politics of Erdogan and know the conflicts, but the internal use, what are they saying about the
general will of the people? The rhetoric is representative of the general will of the people. So anytime there is elections, anytime there is, let's say, constitutional change, it is always referenced to the general will of the people. So that's why I think majority imposition fits to the rhetoric as well.
Okay.
I'm also supposed to comment the report, Oya and colleagues, but time is flying, so I will be really brief. So hard case, as Peter Stone said, Turkey is a hard case, although Bulgaria is not an easy case also. But you mentioned 2023, you could not wait. You should do something until the next elections, and if you need any help, we as a scientific consortium maybe could offer something. And I would like to express my sympathy to the progressive part of Turkish society.
Thank you. So the opposition political parties are talking among themselves about how we need a straightened parliamentary system, but the societal debate is now considering whether there could be unity among all political parties. So the problem involves the fact that Turkey could not actually unite all the opposition political parties. So as long as that seems like a possibility, the 50% could be achieved, but otherwise it doesn't seem unlikely. So I think I should add one more thing. I did not include this in the report, but there are also informal local initiatives to involve citizen deliberation. So these are either like e-government type of initiatives organized by opposition-controlled cities, or these are like websites where you can go in and submit your votes and your preferences for, let's say, changing the city center plans or something like that. So there are these informal initiatives that are not part of the constitutional dynamics at all, but the hope is that these could become precedent for the type of, let's say, politics that could be implemented under the opposition rule. And if that turns out to be a successful experience, it could be replicated at the national level in some distant future. More comments? Questions?
Enough.
Okay. So we have Moldova case that we didn't discuss at all. Did anyone get a chance to read it? Austria, did you get a chance to read it? I have some comments regarding formats, but if you can say a few words, I think we should also cover Moldova.
Yeah, I read it, and I mean, okay, on the one hand, I thought it quite interesting how the constitution is phrased and framed, and that completely opposite to the Austrian one, there's a lot about values and nation state and language and whatever have you. And I thought it was also interesting how it was described. I would have loved actually to discuss that at more depth, how constitutional change is brought about and in how far that the authors of the report saw that as appropriate or not. Just let me, and also, and I think this is also something that we should keep in mind for all our cases, the difference between the constitution in the written constitution and constitution in action, so to say, constitutional practices. And this is something which is very strong in this report, that the practices differ very much from what is written. And I think this is not an exclusive problem or a feature of Moldova. I think this is something we could keep in mind. However, what I'm missing completely in the paper is the deliberative part. I mean, not even the negative, saying it doesn't exist. So I just couldn't find mentioned somehow. And I think that especially when we follow the advice by Dobrinka and say that we kind of publish that, we have to do something about that. So this must be there. I mean, even if it doesn't exist in the country, it also doesn't exist in Austria, but somehow we have to deal with this non-existence.
Yeah, I think it should be clarified that it's not practiced or it's not there. But I realized that there was a sentence that went ahead and said popular initiative to revise the constitution, but it doesn't explain it afterwards. So if our Moldovan colleagues get to listen to this talk afterwards, maybe they can take this as a suggestion. And I thought something that was also missing was how these recent developments from 2016 with regard to the Constitutional Court's decision, how that affected the EU integration project, because I think that those two segments of the report do not talk to one another. And from what I have followed through with the Moldovan politics, the recent years has also seen further crisis over this suspension of the president by the Constitutional Court for failing to, let's say, appoint a cabinet member. So I thought that was also something interesting that is going on in Moldovan constitutional politics, but I couldn't see it in the report. So maybe more recent developments on how this, whether this would be considered as an interference by the Constitutional Court, or whether this is the Constitutional Court acting the way it is supposed to do, or we should consider this as a case of politicization of the court or judicialization of the constitutional politics. I'm not sure which one fits, and I would like to see how our Moldovan colleagues see it. Okay. Other comments from anyone who has read the Moldovan report? Or I think somebody joined from Moldova and then left. I saw a name, but I wasn't certain. Okay, so if anybody has final comments, the floor is ours for another 5 minutes. If not, we can conclude. We can conclude? Is that a nod? Okay, I see a nod. Okay, thank you so much. So thank you to everyone who showed up. And I think we will be uploading this afterwards. So I'll see you hopefully in future in person.
Thank you for sharing.
Huh?
Thank you for sharing.
It was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. I wish we could be in person. So hopefully next time.
Sure.
Okay. So
Okay.
see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.